Peace, everybody. Welcome back. Thanks again so much for your support. And I hope are enjoying this exclusive access to my supplemental course videos for Tip of the Spear as much as, and half as much as I do. I'm thoroughly enjoying going back through the book again and engaging all of its fascinating and complex layering. Again, my focus is ultimately often on the immaterial, communicative consciousness, public opinion, some of the sociological aspects trying in terms of this course. So please feel free to comment and let me know what you think of my focus and what you think I'm missing, what you would like to see, or maybe would have liked to see highlighted, or what you see in these chapters as being of more value. Please feel free to do as I'm inviting my students to engage with your own comments, questions, queries, conundrums, catechisms, cacophony, critiques, and so on. Let's continue the conversation. But ultimately, thank you very much again for your support. And like I said, I hope you enjoy this even half as much as I have. And big shout out to Dr. Burton for this incredible work, and to all of us for engaging it. Peace, only if you're willing to fight for it. Like Fred Hampton used to say, let's get into it. All right, welcome back, everybody. Let's get right into Tip of the Spear, Chapter 2, Black Solidarity Under Siege. And this time, I actually will be keeping it shorter than the last two videos. It's just that there's so much in this book and in these chapters that it can get a little bit difficult to contain. But so please continue your own study, continue to raise questions, continue to follow up on what is in this book, the footnotes, the names, the ideas, and evolve your critical and radical thinking capability. But again, for me and for us, what I'm asking us to consider, and please don't let me limit you in terms of your imagination and your approach to this, but what I'm drawing out of it and what I find most relevant to a class on sociology of prisons is, again, the role that prisons are meant to play within society, not just in terms of how they interact with the prisoners themselves. So looking beyond the specific details of what Burton covers in this chapter, what I just would like to highlight from it are, again, the way he's asking us, I think, to consider our broader relationship to society and how the prison as a microcosm of that relationship represents all of that. So just out of the gate, and this is something I would love to bring up more in this class that I get into separately elsewhere, but this is one of the reasons just why I have this real disdain for museums. I see them in terms of how I read what Burton is saying at the beginning of this chapter about archives, filing systems, categorization, the construction of what Burton says, the architectures of truth. And that museums are really, I think, in the context of colonialism and imperialism, have to be understood as trophy warehouses, collections of colonial victories. They're trophies to be held up and shown. Look at what we've done. Look at who we've conquered, and look at what we've accomplished in our imperial land and resource and human grab. So that's what I just thought was fascinating, and that the goal here is to extract knowledge from their targets, as Burton writes, in this human filing system that is to surveil, so it is, again, like what is collected in a museum. It's there to not only be a trophy, but as something to mine for information about those being conquered. And then, of course, as he's talking about the goal of all of this was as he says, by the late 1960s and early 1970s, all of this was increasingly weaponized against Black insurgency. So that the goal of suppressing Black rebelliousness and uprise is again key to all of this, both inside and outside of the prison. And as a response, I love the way Burton talks about this in terms of the struggle to reclaim ideas and concepts and a way of understanding the world. So he talks about the prisoners' insurgent letter writing praxis, both in terms of its limitations, but the intent to reclaim some narrative control, the ability to tell one story. And then, of course, as Burton talks about, this is contested and this becomes part of another site of struggle. And that's why I think it's important that he notes that the archive is incapable of containing or disciplining the walking archives and black radical knowledges that it holds. So there is an attempt by museums and archives to limit, though they can't ultimately, but the goal is to limit those walking archives, to take the people and the lived experience and the analysis and the critique out of the dominant narrative and display it as those in power would prefer. And then on page 52, when Burton is talking about the general antagonism or hostility, the colonized, the incarcerated are held within regimes of oppression, which create the dialectical inverse for the colonizer, which is a zone of enlightenment. And this is that dialectic, that struggle, that one needs the other. One can't exist without the other. The colonizer has to recreate regimes of oppression. So it's not just the physical borders. It's not just the bars. It's not just the cells. It's not just the police. It's not just, for those of us on the quote unquote outside, it's not just the so-called hood or community. It is a broader, less defined regime of oppression that involves the physical abuse, but psychic and symbolic and narrative abuse as well. But all to create for the colonizer or the ruling elite a zone of enlightenment. And again, just with my own bias and frame and interest in media and immaterial manipulation of consciousness, just all the times in this book and in this chapter that Burton is making reference to, again, things beyond the physical boundaries, symbolic obliteration, Sylvia Wynter and the genre of human being, creating categories of human being the same way we're categorized musically and elsewhere, all for the purposes of delineation, separation, manipulation, marketing. He talks about the state's deceptive framing of the events of uprisings. He talks about, that is Burton, and yet fully aware that their bodies would be crushed, they continued to resist. In doing so, they struggled on a third terrain, one that is nurtured a being beyond the body, a spirit, a social consciousness, an affective state that is largely beyond representation, searching for demanding human treatment and human dignity. In the letter writing struggles, it's a battle over a counterinsurgent narrative, or the struggle against a counterinsurgent narrative that the state wants to create to suppress the insurgency, which are the oppressed, colonized, in this case, black incarcerated figures, but outside of the prisons are the rest of us. Again, look at how often he's talking about dominant narratives and the way the story begins, the impact on page 54 of the New York Times setting dominant narratives, because the dominance on page 55, Burton writes, because of its dominance on the narrative terrain, the state was able to shape public perception of the struggle in real time to condition our historical forgetting. He's talking about a lot about Black radical discourse and imagination. So within the beautiful physical struggle that these prisoners are engaged in, there is so much of this contestation for how we think and see things and understand our relationship, because that's ultimately what determines our behavior. How we understand our relationship to one another, to our society, determines ultimately our behavior. So much of this is about not only physically incarcerating people, but manipulating our consciousness. He ends up, that is Burton, describing something that I've written about and spent a lot of time in my life with, but just a concept in media or journalism called emancipatory journalism, which in short, which is described on pages 58 and 59, is those who are oppressed engaging in the production of their own journalism and media. That, as he says, Burton says, does not pretend to be dispassionate or objective. There's no goal of being objective. The point of producing that media is to inform the people in your ranks, to encourage others to join you in an anti-colonial struggle. So it's beautiful to see that kind of history and journalism discussed in this book in the context of the rebel letters that Burton writes about, in which he describes as part of a goal of knowledge production. So again, emancipatory journalism, that is, or again, people in struggle producing their own journalism and media, is to produce knowledge, to create new knowledge, to impart new knowledge to those in your community who you want to join your struggle, your movement, your anti-colonial fight for freedom and liberation. Burton describes the rebel letter writing as a discursive technology of counter-war. Discursive meaning the multiple ways of conveying messages and meaning beyond physical, beyond just one mechanism or method of communication. Part of a collage or a panoply or a potpourri of rebellious well, as he writes on the next page, insurgent counter-humanism. In other words, the multiple ways, and again, much like society impacts people within it in a variety of ways. It is not just one mechanism of teaching, of manipulation, of educating, of informing, of constructing a consciousness. It's a variety of ways, and this is sort of what as I understand what Burton is saying about the letter writing is the attempt of those imprisoned to reclaim that as a and as a result, as Burton talks about, the physical containment of these prisoners was inadequate as an infrastructure to contain Black insurgency, as he writes on page 68. A variety of uprisings occur, and then, as Burton writes again on page 68, through implacable resistance, non-cooperation, and epistolary insurgency. Epistolary just means written. That's the rebel letters. Their counter-humanist praxis appropriated and redistributed a fraction of violence that encircled them, seeped into their pores, and assailed their psyches. In so doing, they communicated their refusal to be dominated and their desire to be liberated from humanity as embodied by their captors. And that's sort of what when backing up a few pages, that's what I was referencing. The insurgent counterhumanism was a rejection of the humanity imposed, the form of humanity imposed by their captors. Creating a new humanity was part of the goal, or was the goal. Engaging Fanon's dialectics of violence and liberation, George Jackson had written, two men die with the stroke that slays the slave master. The slave master dies in a way that he can do no man any further harm, and then the slave mentality of the former victim dies. Two men die with the stroke that slays the slave master. The slave master dies in a way that he can do no man any further harm, and then the slave mentality of the former victim dies. So that's what Fanon, George Jackson, Burton is asking us to consider here, that the colonial violence or the anti-colonial violence is a righteous violence against the already established foundational violence of the colonial setting, of the initial colonization, which is violent. The counter-violence against that is required to not only kill the colonizer, but to kill the mentality of the colonized, so a new humanity can emerge. And as a former drummer, the sound of a different drummer concluding section of this chapter is just bars to me. And again, just notice so much of it is about spirit, cognitive rebellion, the relationship of music, listening to free jazz as one writes their guerrilla warfare manuals. And I encourage you, check out Alice Coltrane. Check out her work. And of course, her late husband, John, both of them unfortunately have passed, and of course, John Coltrane. Check out Alice and John Coltrane's work. And you'll hear what he talks about, maybe the poetics, as Sarah Ilmoud and Shania Cordes call the poetics of living rebellion. You'll hear it in the music. And again, he concludes the chapter by making a reference to the likely sacrifice that George Jackson made. Again, you should, without engaging in any of the popular media or that ridiculous Hollywood film that at one point came out about it, please read about George Jackson, read Blood in My Eye, read Soledad Brother. I'll even put the link to the video mixtape my homeboy and I made a decade ago. But the story is again, the story is fascinating. George was heroic, and Burton concludes this chapter in reference to him, because it's the assassination of George Jackson that leads to a new level of a prison movement, and Burton and others have argued is really the foundation of what we consider today the modern day anti-prison movement, the radical wing of the abolitionist movement, and others. But certainly is what prefaces, that is, Jackson's assassination prefaces the Attica uprising, which chapter 3 begins to look at. So, all right, everybody, continue to work your way through the book and the chapter. Follow through with the assignments. I look forward to the discussion and any emails and any questions, concerns, queries, conundrums, catechisms, cacophony, calumny, consternation, contemplation, condemnation, certainly no conflagration. And how about a little congratulation to all of us for struggling through this wonderful book. All right, let's keep moving. See you soon. Peace.